Seth is a long-time venture capitalist and has been working with startup for more than 20 years. He's the co-founder of the Foundry Group, which you probably, most of you know, and also Techstars is a part of it. So our second guest is Elizabeth Mcbride. She's the founder and editor of the Times of Entrepreneurship, and also an international business journalist for outlets like CNBC, BBC, MIT Tech Review. She's especially interested in covering startups in the MENA region. And our lovely moderator tonight is Amy Kosper. You probably know her from our previous interviews. She's former vice president and editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Media. She attended Startup Istanbul a few times. She conducted many talks in our YouTube channel. So we are happy to welcome her again to moderate today's talk too. I want to keep it short because we will definitely have a lot of hot topics tonight. So I will now hand you over to Amy to start the interview. My last quick note is a recorded version of this webinar will be available in our Startup Istanbul YouTube channel right after this webinar is completed. So have a good evening to all. Yes, Amy.
Thank you, Alif, and thank you, everybody at Startup Istanbul. You guys are amazing, and the work you do is inspiring to a lot of people around the world. And I am pleased to be here with Seth and Elizabeth. You guys wrote a book over the pandemic called The New Builders. And I kind of want you guys to walk me through this concept of new builders. What are they? Why do they matter? And why did you write this book? What was your inspiration? So let's start with you, Elizabeth.
Well, we wrote the book. Well, I will start with who the new builders are, and I'll leave it to Seth to tell our backstory, if you will. So the new builders is the name that we have given to the next generation of entrepreneurs, and the broad swath of them are in the United States, mostly women and people of color and immigrants to the US, as they've always been. We came up with the name of the book, and we wanted to give the next generation of entrepreneurs a new name because we feel like they're being overlooked in the United States. In the US, the tech narrative has really overtaken the business world to a great extent. And it means that people aren't recognizing the contributions of the breadth of entrepreneurs. Because most entrepreneurs here and everywhere in the world are not, the software focused, the VC backed entrepreneurs. Most entrepreneurs are like hairdressers and restaurant owners, corner store owners, people who may use technology and be tech enabled, but they're not the VC backed companies. And in fact, in the US, only about 1% of all companies get venture capital. So we really felt like we needed to bring some attention to the real world of entrepreneurship and remember that that's the driving force of our economy.
I think I'd add a couple things to that, Elizabeth. The book itself is about entrepreneurship in the United States, but I think one of our observations is that there are new builders all over the world. And in fact, we've already started talking about the sort of the next version of the new builders will be an international edition. And it's probably important to, Amy, to your question, because really where Elizabeth and I met was around a shared interest for entrepreneurship around the world. And in particular at the time in the Middle East, I was doing some work in Palestine. Elizabeth was actually physically at the time we first met was in Jerusalem. And we would just trade stories about really interesting entrepreneurs that were doing things globally, whether that was in Turkey or Syria or in the US. And one day she was in Boulder and she swang by the office back when those sorts of things happened. And we started talking about this sort of paradox, right? I mean, we knew there were interesting people starting businesses that were doing lots of different things, but what you read about in the press, and this is true globally, we're more the technology entrepreneurs, and nothing wrong with tech entrepreneurship. Certainly both of us spend a lot of our day jobs, Elizabeth as a business journalist and me as a venture capitalist, working with and thinking about technology founders, but we felt like perhaps the air was being sucked out of the room by the tech world, and that we weren't sort of seeing what was going on in entrepreneurship. So we thought we'd write a book about it. And pretty quickly, when we started doing the research, we realized there was actually a bigger story. It wasn't just that their stories weren't being told. It was that entrepreneurship is in a profound state of decline. And this is, for the US economy, this is incredibly troubling, because small businesses are really the workhorse of the US economy, as they do globally, create really the majority of jobs. And so we realized, hey, there's more here. And then we spent about a year doing research, meeting new builders, talking to academics. And then as we started to write it up, COVID hit. And then we realized that there was even more urgency. And so we, if you can believe it, Amy, we actually wrote the entire book. The actual writing portion of it was really kind of May to October of last year. So kind of took advantage of the pandemic, and you know, it was a lot of work, but of course a labor of love. And we realized that these stories needed to be told, and we needed to get the word out sooner rather than later.
First of all, I commend you on writing a book during a pandemic. I took a gap year to write a book. And at the end of my gap year, I had 200 words on one piece of paper. So it was not an ideal experiment for me. But I want to go back to what you were talking about, Seth and Elizabeth. Also, you're talking about, you know, when we think about entrepreneurs, and actually I think it's globally as well, we think about Silicon Valley. We think about, you know, the work that Techstars has done globally. And, you know, that's because that's where the money is. That's where the deal flow is happening. And so, you know, if you want to change the narrative, of course, you have to tell these stories. But how do you, because money is where attention naturally goes because it's shiny, how do you change that? I mean, I think it is a really interesting theory, but how do you change that perspective? I think the book is one way, but help me out here.
Well, so I founded a publication, actually. So my work is broader than the book, right? Times of Entrepreneurship is a publication that takes a broader view, both in terms of who the people are, women and people of color, which has been a very interesting exercise for me to get my own mindset shifted, right? Around the fact that all the powerful people in the world are not white men. And so we do that, but we also don't focus so much on the money, right? Because in fact, that is one of the issues, I think, when you're only writing your stories about the deals or the money. Those are the sub-theme in actuality, because in people's lives, most people are generally not entirely driven by money, right? And in fact, most people are not even more than 50% driven by money. Like the bulk of the world wants enough to live, and business owners are the same way, right? They want to create a sustainable business, but they're not entirely focused on the bottom line. So when you make that shift, you do a lot more interesting stories. And I think that's actually how you start to make people realize that if you're uncomfortable with this endless pursuit of dollars or whatever currency you're operating in, you're not alone. In fact, you're in the majority.
So when you guys went into the process of writing this book over the course of this pandemic, you know, one of the things, when I was at Entrepreneur Magazine, one of the things we were challenged with every single day was, what is the definition of entrepreneurship, right? And so I am very curious to get, you know, Elizabeth and Seth, both of your opinions on, because Branson defines entrepreneurship as the act of creating something where there was nothing, right? And that can be, you know, macro or micro. So, you know, maybe tell us what your definition is, and then give us a case study, an example of one of these new builders. And then I have a question about some of the things you've written, Elizabeth, but let's start with defining, you know, entrepreneurship, because globally, you know, while it's very comfortable for us, you, Seth, Elizabeth, and me, to talk about entrepreneurship around the world, It's very, very different. And the idea of entrepreneurship is really quite, it's like you're a member of the mafia if you're an entrepreneur. So maybe if we start with defining those terms, it will help, inspire the people who are watching us right now.
I think that's a really important observation, Amy, right? I mean, and this is one of the challenges, and we talk about it quite a bit in the book. First of all, we trace the history of the word entrepreneur, and talk a little bit about what it means, but we also, in particular, talk about the ways in which the technology world has usurped, right, or taken this word entrepreneur that for hundreds and hundreds of years was broadly defined, right? It actually comes from a French root. It means to undertake. People have described entrepreneurs as wild spirits, and I like Branson's idea, right? Make something where something was not, and that's how we think about it, right? I mean, entrepreneurs we think of it very broadly. Entrepreneurs are people that are endeavoring to do something and do something different, right? To create something out of nothing, and I think that that we've done ourselves a disservice. It's interesting to think about too. We talk a little bit about this in the book. We trace the history of this trend of entrepreneur to be narrowed only to mean technology entrepreneurship, and it was kind of a tool of diplomacy and democracy. Ronald Reagan, I think, from his experiences being governor of California in the U.S., which is obviously the home of Silicon Valley, and he watched the birth of Silicon Valley, and I think he recognized the power of entrepreneurship as a tool for diplomacy, right? It separated the United States from Russia, and so he would USSR at the time, of course, and of capitalism versus communism, and he used it to help describe the differences between those two economic systems. But in so doing, he ended up inadvertently, maybe he meant to, causing the word to start to narrow and to really mean more the kind of technology entrepreneurship that he had been referring to relative to Silicon Valley. And so that really started this 40-year plus decline in our narrowing of our view of entrepreneurship. And I think part of what we're trying to do is take that back. And there are amazing entrepreneurs working all over the world, whether they're making soap in Syria, or building a tech business in Istanbul, or a corner shop in Longmont, Colorado, where I am, right? I mean, these are all people that have real economic power and agency. And I think, you mentioned this in your last question. I think one of the challenges with the way that we think about the world now is we're in the technology sector, and in the business press, we're all unicorn hunting, right? Which is the term we use to describe these billion-dollar businesses. And I understand why they make for interesting stories, I suppose, but I think we need to recognize that the world unicorns are fine. Venture capital is not a particularly effective method for broad-based economic development. Most deals fail, right? 66% of venture deals fail to return capital. By one Kaufman statistic, 75% of venture funds fail to return capital, let alone keep up with the like a treasury bill return. And what we talk about is like the world needs, if we're gonna develop more broadly, the world needs more camels, right? Not mythical, maybe not as sexy, but hardy and a little bit more slow moving, but workhorses of the economy. And I think we need to start recognizing that those are stories to be celebrated, right? I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to tell maybe one of the entrepreneur stories, new builder stories that we talk about in the book, but celebrating those stories, which is why we wrote the book in the first place. We would love to see the mainstream press, and it's really what Elizabeth does every day now at Times of E. But we'd love to see the mainstream press looking for those stories. Here's a business, and it started, and it was hard, and now they employ 10 people. And that's a huge success because there are millions of those businesses all over the world. But we tend to focus on, here's this company and it was created from nothing, and now it's worth $1 billion, skipping the fact that there were thousands and thousands of other businesses started at the exact same time that are now worth nothing because they failed.
Right. Do you want to jump in, Elizabeth?
And say, well, so I have so many thoughts from that, right? Because the reason I became a journalist, and I think the responsibility of journalists, is to tell the stories of the underdogs. Mm-hmm. So everywhere I went around the world, I'd have assigning editors for the years I was a freelancer, asking me to find those unicorn stories or this hot, sexy startup. And everywhere I went, I was committed to at writing that story and then writing another story that fed my heart, right? And the story that fed my heart was usually about like the taxi driver, the lady taxi driver in Dubai, or the Syrian soap startup, or you know, the fisherwoman of Gaza, right? So I pursued those stories at the same time, and then eventually at Times of E devoted my coverage to that. And what I found over the years is actually there's a huge appetite for those stories. Right? Yeah. It's not like there's not an audience there. So it kind of confused my mind for a while. Why was that? And then I sort of came to realize that the big media companies were in fact serving the interests of the big institutions. Right. But I'll give you the story in our book, which is kind of the narrative backbone of the book, is about Danaris Mazzara, who is a baker in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She's an immigrant to the United States originally her family's from the Dominican Republic. Her mother was a restaurant owner in Puerto Rico. And then the family migrated to the US, and she kind of followed this path of many immigrants to the US. She got married to a man from her community. They were both working factory jobs. And then the recession, what we call the Great Recession of 2008, 2009 hit, and her husband lost her job. She had a newborn baby. She still had her job at Samsung. It was a factory, but it wasn't enough to pay the bills. And her mother dropped by one day and said, I know that you're in a really hard time right now. Here are $37 worth of food stamps.
Yeah.
And she laid on her couch and she looked at the ceiling and she thought, this is not even enough to buy a week's worth of groceries. And she heard a voice in her head that said, make flan. Flan is a custard that is part of the Spanish culture. And so she made flan and she started to sell it in the break room. And out of that start, she eventually grew a bakery business that now employs more than 15 women, all women in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And she's really part of that whole community's effort to lift itself, right? And I don't know about you as a journalist, but like that is a much better story to tell than another white Ivy League educated guy starting an app. Right?
Yeah, it's so true. And it's, I mean, I read that story. It's on your website.
Yeah.
And it is an uplifting story. And I think that your work, and I have a question about that for you in just a second, but you know, what it speaks to is the human spirit and what is possible in, you know, impossible situations. To me, that's what defines entrepreneurial and not entrepreneurial. And, you know, as far as the media goes, you know, if I see one more cover with Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop, that is not
fair, totally fair.
That is not entrepreneur, that is different, right? So, you know, the chasing of stars and celebrity to represent really the human spirit to me is disingenuous. And which is why, you know, when I am reading your work, it makes it very real. It's like reaching into the soil. It's the real stories, right? And that's why it's so important globally, I think, to tell these stories and to get people to go to your website and read your work, because these are real people who are pivoting not just some tech company, but their lives. And, you know, their lives depend on their ability to be nimble and agile, and to listen to the voices and to follow the fire in the belly. And just real quick, and then I want to ask you a question. When I started at Entrepreneur, I was like, what is it? Is it magic? Is it a startup? Is it a small business? So I went into the morgue, right? The morgue is where we kept all the old issues, right? Back when, you know, in the...
I love it that you use that word, yes.
And it is a morgue now more than ever.
Yeah.
But I picked up an issue of Entrepreneur magazine from 1985. And this is a real story. I know my people, the Irish, are prone to spinning some yarn, but this is true. So I picked up 1985. And it was a quarterly at that time, Entrepreneur Magazine. And I am not kidding when I tell you the cover story, 1985, which is not that long ago, was how to start a mail order Asian bride company, right? That was entrepreneurship, right? Right. And so we have come so far in what our storytelling is. And, it's not just about, making a quick buck, right? It's much more soulful, I believe, than that. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about your book. And I wanted to ask you, so you had written, Elizabeth, that you wrote that there are surprising advantages of the new builders. And can you explain what those advantages are and how maybe a global audience can learn from that?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And I also just want to say one thing, which is sometimes I tend to be reactionary against, I think, the white male tech company world in a way that's a little too strong, right? Because there's so much value in that world as well, right? So I just wanted to make that caveat.
And I can't be as reactionary because it's literally my day job, and my entire career has been built there. So there is that too. Although we can talk about the ways that we've been trying to I've been trying to diversify my day job too. But yeah, no, thanks for saying that, Luther. We have this wonderful writing partnership because we do have differences of opinions, right? And we generally align in terms of our global views. But one of the nice things about writing a book with someone else, other than just I learned a writing style that was, I thought, really just a wonderful style by working with Elizabeth. But we do have these like conflicts and disagreements, and we need to work it out because the book is a reflection of both of us. And so it was a really nice partnership. Although I joke, we're sort of like a 20-year married couple now. We kind of, bicker at each other occasionally, and it's fun.
I can only imagine. It's such a process.
But I'll quickly say what I think the advantages of new builders are, and then I think Seth will have things to add to that too. But from my perspective, advantages of new builders. Well, I remember a Palestinian investor, Zahi Khoury, telling me that the entrepreneurs in Gaza were like diamonds, right? If you are starting a business in that hard circumstance, then one of your advantages is that you are incredibly tough. Ways that a lot of people who have it so much easier just have no idea, right? Of how many, what does it take to lie on your couch and think, I've got $37 in food stamps, I'm just going to try, right? And if you have that attitude, I'm just going to try, you don't have a lot to lose, actually, right? Which is incredibly important. So that's one. But I think the most important advantage that new builders have is their ties to their communities, which we undercount and which a lot of times they don't realize. And I think this is especially true for women of all colors and ages, right? Is that women are so good at establishing relationships with people, but they don't always have a great concept of how to use those relationships to move forward. I don't mean use in kind of a negative way, right? But how we all move forward strongly together. So I think those are two of the key advantages of new builders all over the world.
Seth, did you want to add anything to that? Because I want to get, like, what you're talking about, Elizabeth, is the diversity and inclusion. That is a very big part of both of your core values that come through in the book. And it's a topic that excites me, but also irritates me because we have been talking about this for years, right? I mean, I slept in a shanty town on the campus of University of Colorado to protest apartheid. My mother burned her bra in the 60s. We are still having the same conversations. And I think this is a global topic. I'm just using very US centric examples, but what do we need to do to make impact? How do we make this change? Really, I mean, we're talking about it. Is it Black Lives Matter? Is it the Me Too movement? when are we going to see meaningful change when it comes to diversity, inclusion, getting more women on boards, getting more diverse people in startup funding? Like, what, it's so big and it gets me so irritated that I think we need to talk about it just for my mental health.
Totally fair, because it's incredibly frustrating to be fighting the same fight. I remember there was a sign in one of the women's marches that I went to that was sort of, it was like an older woman, like a 80-year-old woman, and she was holding up this sign and it said, "I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit," right? Sorry. And it's kind of what you're describing. Like, are we really back here again? Actually, I had a conversation with my mom about it as well, who graduated from college in the 60s, and she was sort of saying the same thing. Like, really? Like, are we really going to go down and like protest the same stuff we were protesting in the 60s? Incredibly frustrating. I will say this, I mean, I've lived through a few cycles in venture of the, like, something pops up and venture, people in the tech world say, "Oh, wow, this is really important. This time we're going to take it seriously." And then, not a lot happens. I will say this time feels a little bit different, feels a lot different, actually. And we're starting to see some much more tangible. I wish I had the numbers, actually, because we have 80 portfolio companies, let's say, in our portfolio, maybe 60 of them are active. I'm going to say that, I mean, essentially everyone now is looking to increase the diversity of their board, and the number of, like, the individual number of board members that we've added that are not white men is probably is at least one per board now. I mean, I've got several boards that added several. And so maybe that's, I mean, and I don't think that that's an anomaly. I mean, we had relatively diverse statistics already as Foundry, although it's still not where it should be. But I don't think Foundry is an anomaly in that. I think there's a lot of venture firms that finally woke up and said, "Hey, we're going to do something about this." I've spent a lot of my time over the last couple of years, even before sort of George Floyd, and obviously yesterday was the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. But even before that, trying to diversify particularly the funds that we invest in, because that's where a lot of our portfolio investing comes in. And there are a lot of amazing funds out there that are led by women and people of color, and we've now invested in, and we did not have a very diverse funds portfolio, like, was not diverse at all. And my reflection is that was because the person that we had running that side of our business was traditional, like, 15, 20 years in LP. And there were certain boxes that he would check. And I realized as I went into it a couple of years ago and was like, why haven't we prioritized this? Oh, we've totally prioritized it. We've gotten so close on, and then he'd list out 10 firms that we looked at, but we just couldn't quite get there because they didn't go to this school, or I couldn't due diligence them quite because I needed to know what, these people that I already knew thought of them. And I realized, like, that's the problem, right? Is that the checklist is wrong. It's not that there aren't good people out there. And so we kind of redid the checklist a little bit, and that's resulted in a ton of, I'm going to say 12 funds now. I mean, that's a lot for us because we don't invest that much in terms of our total funds portfolio, but a lot of funds that are majority. I'll say majority, minority. I think minority is the new majority, so it's probably not the right way of saying it anymore. But who have more GPs that are not white men than are white men. In many cases, have no white men as GPs. So, that's just a little vignette into what one group is doing. But my sense is that that's going on elsewhere, right? I mean, it's not. I don't think that our drive to diversify, and by the way, it's not just the boardroom, it's, the next level down is, we're trying to diversify GPs. So investors are being more diverse. That's going to naturally lead to, because those networks are broader and different, that's going to lead to more investments in diverse founders. And we're trying to diversify boardrooms. And then the other thing, we're really spending a lot of time at trying to diversify management teams, because that's the thing that kind of happens most rapidly, right? Just because there's turnover at companies. So I think there's more going on, but it doesn't. We're also talking about 1% of companies, right, which take money from venture capital. So it's an important group, but it's not necessarily indicative of sort of the overall challenges. And we really talk a lot in the new builders about capital access and new forms of capital. How do we get more new builders, more funding? And maybe that's something we'll talk about in a little bit. But that significantly needs to change. And that world hasn't diversified. New builders are diverse, but the people that control the capital that funds new builders is not.
Yeah, and it's almost like, you know, I mean, it's a fascinating thing to think about, a concept, because if you look outside of the, you know, the ecosystem for entrepreneurs in the United States, in other countries, startups and entrepreneurship, it is a much more diverse field. And so it's almost like we in the United States need to pause and look at what other countries are doing. And, you know, Iceland is an unfair example because there's only 326,000 people who live on the entire island, you know, of fairies and volcanoes, you know, but, you know, women are on par with men in Iceland. It is a small case study, but it is powerful. And it is the law. I mean, they have policies in place that women have equal access to capital. And, you know, it's not a diverse deal flow ecosystem, but as far as access to capital for women, you know, my mother, again, the hippie, burned her bra. Actually, I think she would do it again right now if she were able to get around better. But, you know, like, if we need to do better, right? Like, I can't believe I've been a journalist for 30 years and I'm still writing about this. And so, you know, I think that here, you know, we are not setting the bar for the rest of the world. I think the rest of the world is setting the bar for us. And having said that, I want to ask you, Elizabeth, so reading your work and, you know, kind of the sort of the beat that you found with the new builders, I want to talk about values, right? Like values and startups around the world globally. Because one of the things, I write a lot about multi-generational companies right now, family businesses, Nike, Zildjian Cymbals, Burton Snowboards. And one of the differentiators between startups in Silicon Valley, which the world wants, you know, everyone in the world wants to emulate that ecosystem, right? Everybody wants to be Silicon Valley. When you go out as an entrepreneur and you're raising, right, you're looking for funds, you have to have your values stated, right? As soon as the money comes in, the values go into the dustbin of history. When you're talking to multi-generational companies, values are very much present in every stage with every generation. They are passed from generation to generation. And I'm specifically thinking about Zildjian, which is one of the oldest companies in the country. And so talk to me about how values play into the new builder movement.
So I will, but I do, and maybe this will be a slightly more complicated answer. I do just want to pause on your talk with Seth a minute ago about
Absolutely.
The US, the difference between the US and abroad, because I actually think this is a much more pernicious thing, and it's important for people in the rest of the world to pay attention. Because I think the key difference in the US is our ecosystem is older, right? It started in the US and it's older.
Yeah.
So you see the trends, and I see in places in the Middle East, which I know the best, where the trend is that the startup community was more diverse at first. Women were like 30% of the founders of tech companies in the MENA region when I first went to cover it. And today, if you look at the companies landing the big rounds, it is not diverse. It is all men in the power structure. What it takes for change, and Seth doesn't see this that clearly because he is one of the few people in the power structure making change, right? So he doesn't see himself that clearly, but that's what it takes. It takes people in whatever power structure exists in that country or in that ecosystem to embrace the change. I mean, I just, you know, I don't want to pick on Fatty Gondor because he's a friend of mine, but, you know, he will go out and talk about, oh, the MENA ecosystem is fast rising and now we're on the map and blah, blah, blah. And I think, come on, Fatty, like lend 10% of your conversation and say, but we still have this work to do, but we need to be inclusive here. That does not enter into his conversation. And I feel like it's going to take leaders like Seth in every financial power structure to make the change. So I just wanted to say that to get off my chest. And it leads to that conversation about values, because it is about, in the new builders movement, I think that values are, I think it has to do with the fact that if you grow up in a community of color, or if you're a woman, if you're an outsider, you've got to figure out early on what your values are, because that's one of the only things you have, right? And there are so many new builders or people who lead intergenerational companies, big companies, and I've interviewed all kinds of them, right? Who will say, well, they'll say it's a little dark, but they'll be like, I don't want to be on my deathbed thinking about X, right? And they've figured that out, I think, earlier than many people who have easier lives. And they figure that out, they adjust it sometimes if a big life event causes them to change. But one of their core values is often giving back to the community, being part of the community, employing people. Like we've had a great woman who's been on a couple of panels with us who started an empanada company in Denver. And she'll say, this is about employing people for me, right? Like giving people in my community jobs. I'm sure she's going to hold that value. And if her company is passed down, it will be a core value that the company holds.
That's also on your website. So if anybody wants to read these stories, what's your URL? Because it is a really good snapshot of exactly what we're talking about today.
Well, it's www.timesofe.com. But I also really, Times of E, I think it might have been Barack who was like, I was thinking about, can I call it Times of Entrepreneurship because it's so hard to spell? Barack was like, do not let that worry you. Just go ahead, just do it. So I just did it, but I shortened it to Times of E. But we also want to encourage people to buy the new builders, right? And that has a website as well, which is www.thenewbuilders.com. And both the website and the book are so, so much reflective of everything we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's also inspiring, and I think you will find a very friendly audience globally as well as domestically. And Seth, I was really hoping that you, as a VC, and this is such a selfish question about the values, because I'm just really curious what your take is. You've been heavy in tech. I mean, you've been around the block or two when it comes to entrepreneurship and the actual deal flow. Like, how important are values to a startup or an entrepreneur and to the new builders?
Well, I think they're starting to become more valuable. I've been thinking about this a lot recently because I'm reading Rebecca Henderson's book, Reimagining Capital, or Capitalism, I should say. And she talks a lot about companies that are purpose driven and sort of how that can actually produce better financial results. And I think that we've always had a little bit of that at Foundry because we've always been attracted to a certain type of founder. Sometimes it's hard to describe it, but we've certainly said no to a number of deals where it wasn't a founder that we felt like we were values aligned with, right? I mean, I'm absolutely certain that if, Adam Newman had showed up at our office in 2009 or whenever he started, that we would have said no, like this isn't the kind of person that we want to be in business with. And that's worked for us, right? It's not that we've made some mistakes, and it's not that every business is is doing good for the world. And we codified it for Foundry, and we were the first national venture firm to become B certified, which is this sort of global movement to encourage companies to think about constituents other than just their shareholders. Now, that said, we only have one thing that we're measured by, which is IRR, right? Our rate of return. And it does make it a little bit challenging. I think our investors appreciate that we are good people and that we have values. But at the end of the day, we need to return, right? And we're just talking about this because we've been doing a lot of work around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was just on a call earlier talking about, like, how do we describe that? Like, what is that, like to be a values-driven organization and to appreciate and feel that DEI is important is great, but we have to describe it in the context of what our overall business goals are. And our business goal is to make money for our investors, right? Whether those are individuals or pension funds or the teachers union. And so it's interesting to think about that. But I do feel like the world is starting to understand that doing good and doing well aren't necessarily two ends of a teeter-totter, right? You don't have to decide which one goes up and which goes down, but they can actually move together. And I feel like there is, VCs are, they're very much capitalists, right? I joke sometimes, capitalism is in my job title. And so sometimes it's a little bit hard to get people to think beyond just what's the next deal that's going to make money. But I think that people are starting to, we saw this in the Business Roundtable, right? 200 of the largest corporations in America came out with a statement, separate aside about how much they're backing it up, but they at least came out with a statement that said that that companies should consider the return not just to shareholders but to stakeholders, right. Which was a huge departure from the Chicago School of Thinking that was codified really in the 70s, although Milton Friedman's been talking about that since the 50s, which this idea that like the only role of a corporation is to increase profit. And there's, I think, at least a conversation about maybe that's not right. And what does it look like if the role of an organization is to serve other constituents other than just shareholders. And I think what's maybe missing or not been said there is that by serving other constituents, they are still serving the long-term best interests of shareholders, right? I think what's happened is we've gotten caught into this quarterly cycle of quarterly updates and numbers and things like that, and watching the stock price go up and down, and embedded in the idea that your stock price goes down if you invest in paying workers more is a misunderstanding of the longer term benefits of those investments. And I think, we saw Walmart made a bunch of, it's a funny company to call out for this, but they made a bunch of advancements in terms of worker rights and paying their employees. And they were able to do that because the Walton family still owned the majority of the company at the time. So even though the stock price went down and many CEOs might've been fired because of that, they were willing to make that investment because the majority owners were aligned, and it paid off, by the way, right? They've done incredibly well with those initiatives. Not all corporations have that flexibility, but it does seem to come from this misunderstanding of long-term value, which I think what most investors really want to be creating, versus short-term value, which is maybe what the managers of the money, right? There's not the people that are the investors, you and I, aren't the people that are for the most part who are making the investment decisions, which are these money managers, right? And they get paid on quarterly, so they're making decisions that maybe aren't even in our, as long-term investors, best interest, because they want to see their quarterly bonuses or whatever. But anyway, complicated there, sorry to ramble, but I think it's a really interesting topic.
It's fascinating. I know we're close on time, but I wanted to ask you a little question, a little something that actually a startup I was working with recently about the whole notion of storytelling, right? Like everything is storytelling. Your story is where everything starts. It's how you raise, it's how you get IP, it's how you recruit. The story is everything. And so, Seth, from your perspective, is the story more important than the financials for someone pitching you around the world? And I get this question all the time.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And I would say that especially for earlier companies, absolutely is. For the entire, I've been a venture capitalist for 20 years. The entire time I've started every pitch meeting, people start to like jump into the here's my deck and let me start on slide one. And I always say, hey, let's stop. I want to hear about what's the backstory here? Why did you start this business? I always start every pitch meeting that way, because I care about why. I should say that it's illustrative to learn why people start businesses, right. And you learn about them, you learn about how passionate they are. And it's, I tend to gravitate toward businesses where someone had a lived experience and it led them to do something. There are people that start businesses because they went to a business school and they whiteboarded something and they thought, hey, this is a way to make money. Generally, those aren't businesses that we like to invest in, but that's fine too. There's good, that could be the backstory, but I love to start that way because I think, to your point, Amy, that's so fundamental to every business. Why do you even exist?
Fundamental. And I think, to the detriment of all founders all over the world, Silicon Valley's focus on the financials and the pro formas has really disabled excellent, clear, concise storytelling. And I think one of the things in your book is that, you know, it's really a rebirth of this authentic storytelling. And I loved that. And I've only read the book in chunks, like not as one piece. But I love the storytelling of it. And I love the, you know, getting back to the people part of business and entrepreneurship is so key globally, right? People are cool and people do cool things, and people around the world will restore your faith in humanity if you let them tell their stories. And Elizabeth, you've done such a beautiful job with your storytelling of the new builders. And I think I have time for one more question. And I really want, this is the big one, guys. This is it.
All right.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about what is the future of the new builders? Okay, cool. It's a new concept. It's looking at entrepreneurship really in a different lens. And so talk to me. I mean, Seth, you started talking, you know, there's a decline in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial spirit. Like, what does the future look like, you know, globally? What does this mean?
Love that question. I have to tell you, we've done, I don't know how many you think, Elizabeth, 25 or something of these sorts of events and interviews and radio things and stuff like that. No one has asked us that. We always talk about the future. What's the future of business? The future of business is new builders. No one said, hey, what's the future of new builders?
Yeah, that's important.
I love that framing. I would say that, and I'll be quick and then let Elizabeth jump in as well. But I think Elizabeth and I are very optimistic about the future of new builders, right? And I think that it certainly would have been possible to get to the end of this research and you know, to see that entrepreneurship was declining and see all the challenges that new builders face, and to have walked away feeling like, oh boy, like I just don't see the path here. But the new builders themselves are incredibly optimistic, and that optimism really rubbed off on Elizabeth and on me. And I think our view is a very optimistic one. We do need to connect more capital to more new builders. We need to enable more new builders. We need to promote them more. We need to talk about them more. We need to celebrate them more. But the new builders themselves are incredibly resilient and incredibly optimistic. And I think that, you know, they're going to keep doing what they've always done, which is to start businesses based on their passions in their communities, and help lift up themselves, their families, and the people around them. And I think that we feel really very strongly that there is a bright future. But the two of us would like to help be a catalyst for getting more money and more resources to them, because we believe that's what is needed in order for them to really thrive.
Yeah, exactly. Elizabeth, did you want to jump in on that too?
Yeah, I can add two thoughts to that quickly. I think one of the core insights of the book, The New Builders, and of our thinking, is the role that storytelling plays. So we completely agree with you, right? So by acting out the importance of story in the way we told the new builders, I think that is a key part of helping them and in the evolution, right? We do want to get them more money, but that's entwined with helping them take the power of their own stories, right? So I think those two things, money and story, are deeply woven in the future of the new builders. And the other thing I would say is that, you know, out of times of great change, it's like an opportunity. Like out of chaos is an opportunity for change. And we are going through a worldwide pandemic, right? This is a moment where there's probably not a single person on the planet who's not at least devoting a little bit of time to rethinking things. And out of that, I believe there are changes, there will be opportunities. And there are already studies coming out that the kids who came of age during this pandemic do hold different values. They are going to have a different mission. They're going to have different goals. And one of those goals inevitably is going to be deeper ties to their communities. It is going to be the value of things that you can't necessarily quantify.
Right. I mean, I don't even know what to say. I'm going to turn this over to Barack and Alif for questions, but I am so proud of the work that you have done, because it has the potential to open a lot of eyes and to create meaningful, measurable change. And if there's anything, you know, I can do or Startup Istanbul can do to advance that message, we support you. And anyone who is watching these two rock stars, be sure to check out the book, check out the website. Seth, you're all over the website, and it's all good. I checked. And so, you know, thank you for spending the morning with me and with Startup Istanbul. And Seth, I'm over here in Fort Collins. You're in Longmont.
I didn't realize that. That's great.
I'm at my co-working space at Spaces. So.
Oh, love it. That's awesome. We're not that far away. I'm just down the road in Longmont. Exactly.
No, cheers. All right, Brock, any questions? I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful questions, Amy. Thank you so much. This is really fun.
Thank you, Seth and Elizabeth and Amy. It's been an amazing interview, actually, and learned a lot about the book and its background, etc. And as Amy mentioned very nicely, it's very huge impact that we are doing right now on, and we are especially thankful for that. So time is up, and so we thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you in Istanbul or in someday, sometime, and we hope to meet you in person too.
That's an invite. I know both Elizabeth and I would like to come. I haven't been in Istanbul in probably 15 years, so I look forward to coming back.
That was amazing. Thank you.
Amy, Seth, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us today. And we are very happy to host you this evening in Istanbul. And that's also an invitation. We will be very happy to host you in Istanbul after this all pandemic situation is over.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Plan on it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.